The envelope stuck briefly to my thumb when I slid my nail under the flap. Shame tightened my throat, and I read the first line aloud to the car window. If you ever forget who you promised to be, open these. The sentence sat on the paper like a demand. I folded the letter back once, then opened it again because the seal had been brittle for 20 years and I needed the exact phrasing. Shame moved me more than nostalgia. I pressed my palms flat against the steering wheel and forced my shoulders down. A bus hissed past and left rain on the windshield in streaks that caught the streetlights. I kept the car engine off. The building across the street had its lobby light on. A neighbor's silhouette passed by the glass. I counted concrete details so I would stay in the moment. The gold locket at my collar, the damp wool of my coat, the corner of a letter already creased between my fingers. I unlocked the car with the key fob and carried the stack of envelopes into the apartment. I set them on the kitchen table and sat without turning on the overhead light. The lamp over the sink cast a rectangle of warm amber across the worn wood. I stacked the envelopes by date stamps in young Elena's careless hand, 1999, 2000, 2003. Each envelope made a small paper breath when I moved it. I kept my thumb rubbing the edge of the newest seal, feeling the paper grain. Young Elena's writing arrived at me in short lines when I unfolded the first sheet. Her sentences were sharp and quick. Don't settle for the easy safety. She had written, if you are scared, choose the brave thing anyway. I read the lines aloud in her voice and then in mine to check if the two matched. Her voice was bright and raw on the page. My voice had held the letters like old tools. I read 3 letters in a row. In one, young Alina listed rules on an index card. Call people back, keep your promises, go to the quay at midnight if you mean it. I traced the ink where it had bled slightly. I heard the kettle click behind me when the radiator in the hall kicked on. That small, ordinary sound loosened something like a memory of a different apartment, a different life. A knock at the door cut the reading short. The hand at the peephole belonged to Marco Reed, and his coat was still damp from the rain. He held a folded photograph in one hand so that the corner of it stuck out like a small confessed thing. I had not heard his foot in the stairwell. The light on the hallway frosted his silhouette. Alina, he said before I could move, we need to talk. His voice carried that quiet, intense weight I remembered. Shame and a sudden spike of something sharper, defensiveness, shifted beneath my ribs. I stepped around the table and opened the door. Marco's face was an even line of weather. He did not look surprised to find letters scattered. He did not look surprised that I was sitting with my hands flat on the table. You left your window open last time, he said, and held up the photograph so I could see a younger version of both of us on a dock, rain on our sleeves. Do you recognize this? I reached for the photograph and my fingers brushed his. He moved like he always had, careful not to take, careful not to give more than necessary. The contact made a small electric etch behind my ribs. Marco, I said, why are you here now? The question came out as work, a tool to shape the moment. He set the photo on the table next to the letters. I could ask you the same thing. His jaw tightened. You promised things, Alina. I promised things. These, he flicked his thumb against the stack, are not private anymore. Why did you keep them? His question landed as accusation. I pulled a chair in, fingers wrapped around the locket at my neck. I kept them because I needed to remember what I decided to be when I was 20. I said. My voice was low. Why are you asking me now, Marco? You left years ago. I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking. Marco's eyes did not look away when he said, I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because you never read the last one. The sentence struck like a door closing. I blinked. The room narrowed to the photograph, the letters, the point of his mouth. What do you mean? I asked. My voice shortened to a single, straight line. You meet a wait at the quay, he said. You wrote the time and you wrote the place. I stood there. I waited until my shoes were soaked. I waited and the tide came up and I left because you didn't come. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the photo. I thought you had chosen safety over the promise you made us. I thought you had chosen a life where you didn't have to hurt anyone, or be hurt. I thought you had chosen to vanish and leave me to understand alone. I felt a different heat then. Anger. It rose as a defensive line. Marco, you don't know what those years were like for me. You don't know. I stopped because the sentence had the shape of an excuse. He stared hard. Try me. Call it an explanation. Tell me why you kept letters at all if you were going to discard the last one. We argued in clipped lines after that. 3 to 6 rapid exchanges where names were used to anchor the conversation. You left me at the Quay Marco. You left me by choosing silence, I replied. You wrote to yourself to be brave, he said. I was brave in ways you don't get to measure, I said. He leaned forward then and the lamp light sliced across his face. Alina, stop with the speeches. Did you read the one titled, If You Leave, Tell Me Why? There was no such title. I reached for a letter to prove it, but my fingers found the wrong envelope. Marco, I don't remember every title. I remember the rules and external sound. The elevator bell made both of us start. The moment broke. Marco's jaw flexed and then he rubbed the back of his neck as if massaging a knot. Look, he said, quieter, let's look for it. If it's gone, we'll stop this. If it's here, we'll rid it. Either way, tell me why you kept these. We searched the apartment together. I opened drawers. He moved a box of old receipts. The search was an external event, each drawer a minor discovery. Under the stack of letters, a folded index card slid out and cracked open like a small spring. On it young Alina had written, if you ever need a test, choose the door that scares you. I held the card so close I could see the tiny ink blot at the end of the word you. Marco found a corner of paper under the locket chain where flax had worn thin. He pulled at it until a single envelope tumbled onto the table. He did not look at me when he said, Is this it? The envelope had the neatest handwriting of all and a date 2 days after the Quay night. My hands went numb. The room tightened again, this time with a cold that touched my palms. I had believed that note lost. I had believed I had thrown it away the night I left. The discovery became an external force that rearranged the past in a single movement. I took the envelope and held it as if it were a small animal. Marco did not touch it. You left, Alina, he said at last. I waited because you told me to wait. Then you disappeared. I had questions. I had a letter I never read. You sealed something between us and never opened it. The next 2 minutes became a fast exchange of short sentences. Marco, I had reasons. What reasons? I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me from what? Each line sharpened into a demand. Each reply was a retreat or a hold. I pushed the chair back and stood. I needed to move because stillness made the shame louder. I paced to the window and pushed the blind up with one finger. Rain had thinned. Street lamps made small pools on the pavement below. I held the envelope at chest level so Marco could see the stamp. Read it, he said. Read it now and stop circling the truth. His voice had an edge of desperation. For a heartbeat I considered burning the letters. The idea came as a physical image. A match, a bowl, the envelopes curling into ash. My fingers tightened around the paper. Shame shifted into fear, fear that the last note would prove the worst part of my choices. Then the fear narrowed further into a brittle curiosity that felt like a hinge. I slit my thumb under the flap and unfolded the final sheet. Young Elena's handwriting was cramped on the page, as if she had written with cold fingers. The words began with instruction and ended with an address. Go to the small congregation house by the river at dawn. If you choose to leave anything, place it in the locket. If you choose to stay, leave the locket open. It named Marco by a nickname only he used. Marco read over my shoulder, and his face made a tiny involuntary movement, surprise folding into something else. I watched the change in him in real time. Shame slid into something like anger for both of us, then into a question. Why would I tell you to come if I planned to disappear? I asked. My voice was steadier now because the letter offered a single firm fact. Why would I give you a place and time and then not show up? Marco's reply was a series of short lines. Maybe you panicked. Maybe something scared you. Maybe you thought leaving would protect me. Maybe you thought you'd spare me pain. He paused, then said, Tell me which it is. I could not say the real reason at once. The truth was messy and small and required names that had weight. I sat back down and began to speak in measured fragments because long speeches had no use. When I was 20, I said, I loved you the way the letters know how to love. Loud, certain, and foolish. I thought promises could hold us. Then I found out that keeping them would require a cost I was not willing to count then. I was afraid I'd make choices that would hurt you in a way I couldn't undo. I thought if I left quietly, I'd prevent a version of harm. I stopped. The words were concrete, places and acts, no vague metaphors. Marco's hands folded hurt me how? He asked. By sending you into trouble because of me, I said. By tying you to a promise that would drag you into other people's violence. I lied then because I believed you deserved a choice without my mess on it. I thought absence would be cleaner than asking you to carry my mistakes. My voice fell into the spaces between sentences, so that the admission sat like small stones. He closed his eyes and let out a breath. You chose for me, he said, naming the exact thing I had done. There was an emotional shift then in the room from accusation to reckoning. The shift felt like a tool being set down. Something practical needed doing. Marco stood and walked to the bookshelf. He pulled down a slim leather-bound notebook that had belonged to both of us once. He opened it carefully and flipped to an entry dated the night before the quay. You wrote here, Marco, fingers on the paper. You wrote that you feared what you could not control, but you left me a code. Why hide a code if it wasn't meant for me to find? I looked at the words and understood that my secrecy had been half-formed and selfish. A new shape of shame rose, edged with regret. My hands shook when I reached for the notebook. A knock came at the door then, louder and with the rhythm of urgency. It made both of us look up. The external event came at the right pressure. It required a choice in the next moments. Marco moved to the door and peered through the peephole. He opened it a crack and let in the smell of rain and the voice of Mrs. Alvarez from the hall. Mrs. Alvarez, I said. Her presence would be ordinary, but it gave the room a witness. Mrs. Alvarez held a damp umbrella and a small cardboard box. I'm sorry to bother you both, she said, but I found this on the stair landing. It has your name on it, Elena. She handed the box to Marco. Inside lay a letter sealed in wax and a small brass key tied to a scrap of ribbon. The letter seal bore the same initials as my locket. My fingers closed around the new letter as if around a rope. This discovery changed the direction of the night. An external plot element had appeared that neither of us expected. Marco read the waxed seal and then the line on the envelope. From young Elena, he said, and his voice cracked on the surname. The room tightened and the emotional movement changed again. Shame had become anger, then doubt, then a slow, atching accountability. Now curiosity rose like a small animal. The letter in my hand asked for one more test. I opened the waxed envelope and read a single, direct sentence. If you think leaving will protect, remember the man who waited. If you need proof, meet at the river bridge noon tomorrow. Bring the key. It closed with my own initials in a hand I no longer trusted to be true. She wanted you to have the key, Marco. She wanted you to know whether you would come. She wanted you to prove something to yourself. Why didn't you? His words leaned on the question but did not answer it. I looked at the key and then at the locket. The brass felt cold in my palm. I had kept a corner of a folded letter in that locket for 2 decades and told myself it was for courage. The truth was more concrete and less noble. I had been afraid to test whether courage still lived in me. I was afraid the test would change us in a way I couldn't fix, I said. I thought I was protecting you from my choices. I didn't realize I would be deciding for you instead. The admission was a small mechanic, a hinge I had finally opened. Marco's shoulders dropped fractionally. His voice shifted to a steadier cadence. Then read the last one now. Let us stop pretending the past is something we can tidy without each other. Read it, Elena. And then decide if you will go to that bridge at noon. The climax of the night arrived because Marco made the demand concrete. He did not frame it as mercy or punishment. He held the photograph, the letters, and the key. He for a choice and made me the agent of it. My shame became a decision that was the turning point. Either I would destroy the letters and keep my absence, or I would read and risk both truth and consequence. I unfolded the last sealed sheet again and read through young Elena's words in full. She had written a memory of the two of us under a streetlight, hands freezing, promising to keep a pact. Then she had written why she feared staying, a name I had avoided speaking aloud for years. The letter explained the person who had closed a door in front of me that night, and why I thought absence would be the safer path. The room's emotional temperature shifted once more as the explanation reconfigured what Marco thought he knew. Surprise moved him, then indignation. Then gradually a low sorrow. My own reaction moved in parallel. I felt my jaw set, then my shoulders slump, then a fragile acceptance rise like active breathing. You think I left because you were weak. Marco slowly, voice low. But you left because you thought you were saving me. You made a decision for both of us. He named the action, not the feeling. That naming changed the dynamic. We argued briefly after the reading in tight, short bursts. I kept the conversation anchored by names. Marco, I didn't want you to get hurt, I said. Alina, you did what you thought was best, he replied. And it wrecked things, I said. Yes, the answer came like a tool being used properly. When the argument ended, it did so on a practical note. The dawn had started to grey the eastern windows. The letters lay between us like a small geography. Marco stepped closer and put his palm flat on the table so that the photograph and letters were held in place. Go to the bridge, he said. If you want to fix this, go. Bring the key. Bring the locket. See if you can meet what you left. If you don't go, then burn them. Do not let them define you without testing them. He looked at me for the first time that night, without flinching. My final emotion in the chapter was a brittle, careful hope. It was not a surrender to anything grand. It was a practical choice. I would act. I slid the letters back into neat order and placed the smallest one in the locket where a folded corner fit like a seam. I closed the locket and fastened the chain. Marco opened the door and stood on the threshold with his coat collar up against the rain. He carried the photograph and the leather notebook. I held my locket in my palm until the brass warmed to my skin. Then I clipped it around my neck and stepped to the front step with Marco beside me. The last line of the chapter is a concrete movement. I left the apartment with the letters sealed in the locket and the brass key in my pocket, and we walked together toward the river bridge with the dawn stealing color into the sky. Mrs. Halvorson's knuckles hit the wood twice and she pushed a damp, unmarked envelope into my hand. Suspicion tightened my fingers around the paper before I looked at her face. Found it on the stairs, she said, voice low against the muffled building hum. Thought it was yours. The corners torn, I peeled the flap open at the doorway. Rain spattered across my coat. The first folded line inside carried a single name and a date in young Elena's hurried hand. The name snapped something taut inside me. A promise I had sworn at 20, and a fear that someone else had touched what I had sealed for myself. In those first seconds I felt suspicion, then a quick, hot shift toward anger. I had kept those letters private. Someone had no right. I stepped back to let Mrs. Halvorson in for a moment. You'll want to see this, dear, she said, holding the hallway light so her face was a rim of yellow. I told her to go home. She hesitated, then left me the doorway still smelling of her lavender powder. I shut the door, pressed the envelope flat against the lamplight, and read the single line written on the folded corner. Marco Reed, July 6th. The name carried a memory that was not gentle. It made my throat close, not because of nostalgia but because of an immediate argument that had never been finished. I had expected to find my younger voice on these pages, bright, defiant, reckless, but I had not expected a paper breadcrumb that led straight back to Marco. The hallway light blinked outside the peaful. I set the envelope on the shoe rack and crossed to the kitchen with it between my thumb and forefinger. My hands felt clumsy. I placed the paper on the table and ran my nail along the crease as if I could read the past by touch. The kitchen smelled of tea and the wet paper felt colder than the room. There was a second knock, harder and faster. The sound made my chest contract in a way the envelope hadn't. I went to the door and opened it a crack. Marco stood in the stairwell with rain in his hair and an old photograph folded against his coat. He looked as he always had, worn leather jacket, watch with a cracked face, eyes that held questions he would not begin with. He did not smile. He did not ask permission, Alina, he said. He stepped inside without waiting. Water left a dark trail on my hallway floor. You shouldn't be opening things like that alone. I snapped the door. Marco, what are you doing here? He held up the photograph with 2 fingers. I found this in a wallet I kept. I thought you might need it. His voice was low and steady. I felt a shift in me from suspicion to a raw, keen anger. You thought for me, I said. My words were short. So were his. My hands folded over the envelope until the paper creased. He lifted his chin as if the rain had washed some hesitation away. I didn't do it to take your choices, Elena. I thought I was protecting you. He the word protect, and I heard every promise I'd made to myself at 20 recoil. I stepped into the living room and pushed the table light on. The lamp threw a small circle of yellow across the table, and the photograph lay between us like a question. "Marco," I said, naming him because I needed the name to sit in the air. "Which choices did you think you could make for me?" He did not answer quickly. He folded his hands and looked at the letters, at the single date on the corner. The sound of the rain on the window filled the room while I watched him. When he finally spoke, his voice had the slow, measured cadence he always used when he meant honesty. "I moved things. I kept some people away. I burned a letter once, I won't lie." The words landed like a stone. A sharp shift, anger to betrayal, pulled at the edges of my voice. "You burned a letter." "I asked one," he said. "I thought it would spare you something. I had been waiting 30 years for the letters to tell who I had been, not for someone else to edit what I left behind." I dragged a chair over and sat with the envelope on my knees. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Marco reached for the photograph and set it beside my elbow. The picture showed young Elena and him on a ferry, wind-stealing hair and smiles. My 20-year-old self had a threadbare bracelet and a grin that didn't know how to be cautious. Young Elena's handwriting angling across the back was hurried and fierce. "You wrote to yourself for a reason, Marco. You wanted a map. I thought the map might take you somewhere dangerous." I acted, silence pressed between us, full of decisions made for me. I felt the memory of a morning when I had sealed the last envelope. Thin paper, a cheap pen, a vow to keep promise to myself. I had not imagined anyone would read them, let alone remove a page. I set the envelope down and unfolded the letter inside. My voice changed when I read it out loud. The room contracted into the words that young Elena had left like a charge. "If you ever forget who you promised to be, open these." I read in a voice that carried the 20-year-old's haste. Young Elena's handwriting jerked on the line when she had pressed too hard. The letter moved the present into a small, sharp memory of my own hand sealing wax between my fingers. I could feel the waxes stick against my thumb again. As the younger lines spilled into the room, an old scene crowded forward. I saw myself at a kitchen table 30 years before. Hair in a loose bun, a stack of envelopes, a canvas satchel slung over a chair. I heard my own younger laughter, quick high, and I heard Marco's distant, low voice asking something I had not been ready to answer then. The memory did not blur. It registered in precise moments, the sound of the kettle boiling, the scrape of a pen across paper, Marco leaving with his jacket slung over his shoulder. Young Elena's sentences pushed against my present voice. She wrote, "Don't let other people decide where you belong. Promise me you'll keep the map." My fingers traced that line and the paper trembled. I read the next line aloud and Marco's face went small with a look I couldn't name. "You promised yourself that." "Marco, yes," I said. "I promised." He swallowed. "I know. I thought I knew the danger that would come if you followed it." I slammed the letter down, as if I could close off the memory. My next words came out tight. "Name me the danger, Marco. Tell me what you saw that made you take paper from my hands. Tell me who you thought you were saving me from." I had to force myself not to shout. My voice stayed low because raising it would have meant a different kind of loss. Marco's jaw moved. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The photograph between us caught the lamplight. There was a man, someone who paid attention to you in ways that weren't safe. I intercepted a note once. I intercepted a meeting. I convinced you to go somewhere else. I lied about a train time. I did things you never asked me to do. My breath left in a short sound. The room shifted again. Suspicion turned into a sharper betrayal. I pictured that morning of my 20s when I'd believed I acted alone. Now I could see a hand diverting my steps, a voice altering plans. For the first time, the map I had trusted looked less like a self-made route and more like a path someone else had redrawn. "You can't tell me you kept me safe and expect me to be grateful for the decision to steal my choices," I said. My voice was steady because I needed steadiness. "Say it plainly, Marco. What did you change?" He looked at me as though measuring which piece of truth he could hand over without breaking something. "I stopped you from taking a job in the city for a month. I intercepted a letter you were going to send that would have said yes to someone you had only just met. I convinced your family you had to stay. I thought if I let the storm pass, you'd be better off." I pictured the job with its single window office and the way young Alina had gleamed at the idea of leaving. I remembered writing a letter with a place name and a hope that tasted like salt. Marco's confession rearranged chronology in my head. My mouth went dry. The next emotion moved beneath the anger and the betrayal. Grief that the path I had blamed on myself had been redirected. You chose for me, I said. You chose where the map would lead. I turned the photo face up again. Young Alina looked stern in it, not yet gullible. You made promises about what would happen to me without asking me. Marco's shoulders rose and then fell. The rain traced lines down his coat. He held his hands up as if the gesture could explain a life of choices made in the name of safety. I know. I should have told you. I should have been braver in the way I told you. I was afraid of what might happen if you left and of what I couldn't fix. The argument that followed was quick and sharp. I asked for specifics. He produced a margin notation from one of the letters he had kept, a shortened note in a small, neat hand I recognized as his own. I found my voice in fragments of accusation. Marco, you wrote on my paper. You wrote in the margin of my own vow. I did, he said, because I thought you wouldn't see it. I thought you needed a push away from a decision I judged dangerous. He spoke the last words slowly. You decided danger for me, I said. The line between us felt obvious and raw. Who gave you the right? He sat very still. No one. We went through 3 rounds of questions in under 8 minutes. Each exchange was tight, a series of short lines. I asked where he'd put the other letters. He kept a corner of one in a box with his watch. I demanded why he never returned them. He hesitated and said he feared my reaction. I asked whether he had ever read them all. He admitted to reading some. At one point our words became faster and angrier. The kitchen light hummed. You lied to my parents, I said. You lied to me about why I stayed. I lied to you for the same reason I lied to myself. He answered, I wanted to keep you whole. The room held the argument like a small theater. Every time I thought the conversation would stop, Marco something that forced a new question out of me. We collided in 3 rapid exchanges where each answer opened a new wound. Why didn't you let me choose? Because I thought the choice would hurt you. Which hurt would you spare for me? The one that meant you had to run away into someone else's hands. Our voices dropped and then rose again. Each time the tempo changed, I felt an emotion shift. Suspicion, anger, betrayal, grief, a cautious empathy that I fought to keep from softening the accusation. I needed to know what had been taken and why. When the argument reached its sharpest point, Marco slid a small, plain box across the table without meeting my eyes. Inside was a thin, gold locket I had worn once at 20. Inside the locket sat a tiny folded corner of paper. He set it down as if it were evidence. This belonged to you, he said. I kept it after a fight when you stormed out. I thought if I returned it, you might forgive me for the things I did without asking. I couldn't give you the letters back then, because I thought handing them over might push you into danger. I felt my chest hollow in a new way. The locket had been my stubborn possession. Finding it here meant a line of contact I had not chosen. I lifted it, fingers trembling, and the corner of paper inside smelled faintly of smoke and of his wet coat. The paper's edge was worn, and a single word was visible in a margin he had written. Delay, delay, I said. You wrote the word delay on my letter. The single word changed the direction of memory. If he had written delay, then the decision I remembered making might have been nudged. Marco nodded. I thought a delay would keep you safe long enough for things to settle. Anger rose again, bright and sharp. You delayed my life, I said. You set my path back a step and called it protection. He flinched as if my words cut. Then he said something that made my throat close. I thought you would thank me later. The room tightened around that sentence, and then released into a cold quiet. I thought of young Elena's pen pressing onto paper, of the exact angle of the nib, of the way she had sealed promises with wax. I thought of a train I had said I missed and of nights I had spent telling myself the reasons I had not left. Marco's confession reframed those nights. I pulled a chair to the table and spread the letters I had opened. One by one, the pages sat under the lamp. Each letter's handwriting moved between my present voice and young Elena's urgency. I read passages aloud and sometimes stopped to ask Marco a question. Sometimes his silence told me more than his answers. When I unfolded the next envelope, a memory arrived so specific, I could have described the furniture in the cafe where it had happened. A chipped blue mug, the angle of the window that caught dust motes, the exact laugh Marco had made when he offered the worn watch to me. Young Elena's voice filled the room again. "Promise you'll keep the map, even if you have to redraw some roads." The sentence landed differently now that I knew someone else had sketched lines on my paper. By the time the argument reached its peak, I could feel the layers of a life being exposed like separate pages on a table. Marco confessed he had intercepted a man who had followed me that summer. He admitted he had written a note he would later tear out of my envelope. He named a specific man, Graham Voss, who had taken my attention in my early days in the city. He had moved a letter, he had forged a timetable, he had promised my safety and found that promise impossible to keep. I closed my eyes for a breath, and then opened them to ask the question that had driven me back to the letters in the first place. "Did you decide my marriage?" I asked quietly. "Did you help arrange what I thought was my mistake alone?" Marco's fingers found the edge of the photograph, and he looked down. "I did not arrange your marriage," he said, but his voice pulled taut at the edges. "I nudged one choice. When I saw you heading toward a person I thought dangerous, I intervened. I regret it." The accusation and confession formed the chapter's sharpest break. I accused him of deciding my fate for me. He answered with a confession that felt like both apology and defense. The brief, furious back and forth left us raw and blinking under the kitchen lamp. Papers were strewn. The locket rested open like a small, bright wound. Marco stood and put his palms flat on the table as if steadying himself. He slid the locket toward me without a word. The gesture was simple, almost ceremonial. "I can't give you back the years I moved for you," he said, "but I can return this. I will meet you when you want answers. I will not interfere again without your voice." I watched his hands tremble when he said it. I thought of young Elena's command to keep the map. I thought of the way my choices had been rerouted and of the small things, the missed train, the delayed letter, that together had altered the route of my life. Marco took a shallow breath and left a condition with his silence. He wanted something I had not yet agreed to, a meeting at a specific cafe the next afternoon. I felt a new emotion take shape, not trust, not yet, but a brittle possibility that answering would allow me to understand what had been taken. When he stepped back into the rain and closed the door, I sat alone with the letters and the locket. I arranged the corner of paper back into its place and then laid the photograph beside the envelope. I felt the years stack in precise, touchable objects. The gold locket, the damp envelope, the photograph with its dog-eared edge. I turned on the lamp and read the remaining lines of that particular letter. Young Elena's script stopped on a sentence that had guided me for decades. She had written, with the unsparing certainty of youth, that if I ever needed a reason to keep moving, I should remember the person I had been when I wrote the first note. By dawn I had arranged the letters into a neat pile and placed the locket on top. I felt the shift one last time. Suspicion had forced me to open the door. Betrayal had slammed into me when I learned of Marco's actions. Grief folded over what I had lost. And finally, a resolute choice took its place. I would read every letter. I would meet him with questions that needed names and dates and proof. I would not allow my future to be nudged without my voice. I put the locket back on the table, close but not on my palm, and turned the lamp down so the yellow pool tightened. The letters were a map I had once drawn and now had to trace again, with the knowledge that another hand had rewritten parts of it. I sorted the envelopes into the order I had intended, fingers methodical, not sentimental. Outside, the building clock clicked toward morning. I made a small, steady decision and lit the kettle. I set a cup, poured tea, and brought the mug to the table. The locket lay between the letters like a hinge. I would go to the cafe the next afternoon. I would ask the questions Marco had avoided. I would read each letter in full. I would find whatever answers the pages still held, and I would do it in my own time. Then I opened the next envelope and began to read aloud. The lid scraped back and the trunk coughed a dry cloud of dust. Something pale and folded slid out, hit my knee, and stopped. Suspicion tightened my throat the way it does when mail arrives unexpectedly, and I sat with the envelope open on my lap, while the attic's single bulb hummed. The paper was creased in a small, familiar way. My name was not on it. I knew, before I had read a line, that this was one of the letters I had never mailed. Suspicion is the first motion when you find proof where you insisted there was none. I kept one hand on the trunk lid in case someone else heard the scrape and came up the narrow stairs. My other hand unfolded the letter and found a photograph folded inside, a younger version of me at a kitchen table, the corner torn away where another face might have been. I held the torn edge between thumb and forefinger and felt my pulse in my wrist. The photograph forced a memory. The flat kitchen where Marco and I sat with ink on our fingers, scraping the edges of envelopes until they lay flat and identical. I could see the table, the chipped mug Marco used, the way sunlight cut the dust in the window. That afternoon we sealed promises into paper the way someone hides keys in a drawer. That morning and the attic evening were concrete bookends. One had been an oath, the other a question. The suspicion in my chest shaped the question I could not avoid, who had torn that corner, and why was the photograph back in my hands now? I climbed down 2 steps and looked out through the attic hatch into the long rectangle of my living room. Tea stains flecked the floor where a plant's pot had leaked. I set the photograph on the table and opened the envelope fully. The page inside had one blunt line in handwriting that slanted like a quiet demand. If you left her, say why. The line arrived like a knock. My mouth went dry. I wanted to tell myself it could be an accident. I wanted to tell myself the torn corner had been lost years ago and found its way back in some neighbor's cleaning box. That impulse was a soft argument I used against fear. But Lee's name came back to me with precise, cold clarity. Lee, who had lived 2 doors down and who had once promised to keep things safe. I felt the first real shift in the room. Suspicion became something sharper, a pressure that made my hands clench the paper. I heard the house phone ring downstairs. A brittle sound I almost did not answer. Alina. Leah's voice said before I could speak. I brought that box like I promised. I thought you'd rather not open it alone. The sentence landed like a hand on my arm. There's a note with Marco's writing, she added. Who about the letters, Lee? I asked, folding the envelope to hide the line. My voice was small and precise. Who has been asking? A man called yesterday. Leah, he had found something on the stairs. He wouldn't say which stairs. He left my number. I thought it best to bring everything now. Her breath made a small exhale that trembled with something I couldn't call by name. Leah arrived with a battered brown box and a plastic bag of tea. She set both down and watched me. Our conversation moved on quick feet of shared history and careful avoidance. Why now? I asked, because the concrete question needed a concrete answer. Someone's been poking around the building. Leah, Mrs. Halvorsen, me. Someone asked her about an envelope found on the stairs. She looked frightened. Alina. Leah's hands smoothed her skirt. I thought maybe you ought to see what I found. She pushed the box across the table. I slid out a second envelope, the flap tucked in because someone had handled it with deliberate care. The handwriting along the corner matched Marco's. The same long deliberate M and the small loop on his Y. Lee watched my face. Her presence made the attic note a shared problem rather than my private shame. That turned the suspicion into anger for an instant, anger at whoever had been rifling through our building. Anger at myself for imagining I could keep these things hidden forever. I said his name out loud. Marco. Why is his hand on this? Lee and I looked at the envelope the way 2 people look at a small, suspicious animal. Lee tapped the box. There was also a note. Someone asked about the letters and it had an address. They wanted proof. I kept it in case you needed it. She folded her hands as if to hide trembling fingers. We carried the box into the kitchen and sat with the letters as the city beyond the window turned from pale grey to the wet amber of early evening. I read the envelope again, Marco's script the same as the one that had pulled me into a pact years ago. For a moment the room belonged to the 2 of us and the boxes, and the world outside could not intrude. Lee, do you want me to call Marco, Alina? I closed my eyes. The attic light had left dust on my lashes. Yes, call him. Tell him to meet me at the Riverside Cafe tomorrow morning. My mouth made the decision. My hand smoothed a crease in the photograph, as if soothing the paper. The next morning the cafe smelled of bitter coffee and wet coats. Marco arrived wearing his worn leather jacket and the old wristwatch that winded itself with a quiet tick like a counting machine. He sat down across from me and folded his hands before he spoke. "You called, Elena. What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and level. "Why did you write on that envelope?" I demanded. "Who about the letters?" Marco's jaw moved. He looked at the letter, then at me. "Someone came to me last week," he said. "A woman with a stiff voice wanted a specific page. It was evidence." He paused and looked out at the river the way someone looks at a map. "I told her the letters were ours. I told her I had copies." "Who?" I said. The question was a stone thrown into a pond. He hesitated in a way that narrowed his face. "I won't say her name unless you want me to say it where it's quiet, Marco." I kept one scrap, 'cause I thought they'd try to use the letters against you. The word "use" landed like a physical slap. I felt my hands cold on the edge of the table. "Use them for what?" I asked. Marco's eyes did not leave mine. "To prove you were at a night that ended badly, Elena. To prove you walked away." He the last 3 words carefully, because the accusation sounded like a verdict. My chest tightened. Memories rose that I had kept folded inside the same way I kept envelopes. The night someone from our circle disappeared came back in the shape of a specific detail. The sound of New Year's fireworks on the river, the shoe I found under a bench, Marco bending to pick it up. I had not said these things out loud for years, and saying them now felt like placing a map on the table. "You kept it because you thought it could be used against me," I said. Marco dragged a thumb along his cup. "I kept it because I thought someone would look for the letters and use a name. I thought if they could find a corner torn away, they'd call it proof. I kept a copy because I feared the opposite, because I feared they might try to prove you left when you shouldn't have." His voice was low, but his words hit like stones. The cafe door swung once. Mrs. Halvorsen stood in the doorway, coat buttoned, her knuckles white around a damp envelope corner. She moved like someone who carries weight quietly. "Elena," she said, handing me the torn scrap. "Someone found this on the stairs this morning. They me questions. I thought you should know." The paper was damp and smelled faintly of rain. Her fingers trembled when she let it go. The torn corner matched the gap in the photograph. I pressed the paper to the photograph the way you pressed 2 halves of a broken dish together, and felt how the edges fit in my palm. The match made the suspicion into something else, into a possible accusation. The calf felt smaller. My breath shortened. "Who?" I asked Mrs. Halvorsen. She looked at Marco, then at me. "A man in a coat. He, if anyone here, had seen an envelope that didn't belong to them. He took notes." Her voice was small, brittle with a duty I remembered from other kinds of neighborly favors. "We left the cafe in a hurry that was awkward to disguise." Outside, the river walked in straight lines of dull light. Marco fell into step beside me, and I kept the photograph folded in my palm like a compass. We crossed the street to the building where I had lived at 20. The stairwell smelled of old paint and the damp of basements. Mrs. Halvorsen had been right. The stair where the envelope had been found had a scuff on the 3rd step. And there was a smear as if someone had dropped something and rubbed it with their hand. The concrete detail of the smear made the whole thing feel more real than the memory had ever been. "Marco, did you ever remove a letter from the stairs?" I asked, because the question demanded a yes or no. He shook his head. "No, I found one in my coat once, but I never slipped it into the stairs. I kept a copy back then, left the original where you'd left it." He stopped and looked at the landing where a neighbor had leaned a bicycle. "If someone has been moving envelopes around, Elena, we need to know who." The conversation shifted my emotion from suspicion to doubt, and then to a sharpened fear. Each word from Marco carved that path. The building had a neighbor named Jonas who kept late hours. Mrs. Halvorsen mentioned someone at the steps. The facts lined up in small, specific ways that made my choices narrower. I asked Marco, "Did you ever sign anything that mentioned Lee?" The question came out quick. He swallowed. "No, but I wrote a note once at the table. We all did. You remember? If you ever forget who you promised to be, open these." We joked about it. I kept an extra. I thought it would be safer. I didn't expect someone to bring it up 20 years later. His jaw tightened on the last words. "We argued on the landing then." The words came out in short, clipped bursts, because the stairwell made everything sound louder. "Why would someone want to prove I left?" I said. "Because a missing person makes people look for someone to blame." "Marco, you mean me? You mean me, Marco?" My voice broke into a rasp. Elena, I'm not saying Marco began. No, tell me what you are saying. I cut in. I'm saying they might try to use our letters to make it seem like you walked away on purpose, Marco. I'm saying I kept a copy because I was afraid of that possibility. Then why did you not tell me? I said, why did I have to find this in the attic? Because I wanted to protect you from the worry until I understood what they wanted. Marco, I thought I could control it. Our voices ricocheted along the concrete. Rapid back and forth lines came like quick thrusts. You kept this from me! I said, I thought I was keeping you safe. Marco, did you ever think I would want to know if someone was poking through the stairs? I asked, yes, later. Not like this. Marco's hand went to his watch. A shadow slipped across the landing as someone paused at the door. Mrs. Halvorsen stood there, eyes bright. He's taking the scrap to the manager, she said, though no one had asked. I told him. Her breath stopped. The arrival of the manager on the stair added a public element I had not wanted. The confrontation moved from private to official in a way that made my pulse beat at my throat. People gathered on the landing long enough to ask questions. Neighbors shook their heads and said, I didn't see anything. Or, someone's always dropping things here. The small exchanges were all concrete and gossipy, and they hardened the situation into something official. Back at Marco's study, he opened a drawer and produced a folded photograph that matched the torn one I had found. I kept this because I couldn't let anyone call you a deserter without a witness, he said. He smoothed the photograph with a thumb. I kept it because I thought I could be a witness. Why would anyone want to make me a deserter? I ask because it changes the way people remember a night. Marco, it changes where blame falls. The evidence in his hands turned the suspicion into a new, harsher fear. That someone wanted to rewrite what had happened. My reaction was immediate. I tasted metal in my mouth and felt a trembling in my fingers. I did what I had not allowed myself to do in years. I named the missing friend out loud, Samara, I said. The name came like a small thunderclap. Marco's face tightened. Samira left that night, he said. I pressed my thumb to the torn edge of the photograph like trying to seal a wound. The memory that followed was physical. The way Samira laughed and shoved crumbs from a plate, the way she said she would go out to clear her head, the sudden missing shoe. Each specific detail forced me to square choices I had never explained. At the landing that night, the argument reached its peak. Mrs. Halvorsen's concern and the neighbor's notes made the space feel watched. Voices rose the way they do when people try to make small, private things public. Did you move the envelope, Marco? I asked again, the sentence clipped and sharp. No, Marco, I kept copies. I did not move the original. Ask Mrs. Halvorsen, she'll tell you I came to the stair once, but I didn't put anything there. He leaned forward, voice low. I only ever tried to protect you, Elena. Protect me from what? I said. The shadow at the door shifted and someone cleared their throat. The presence made the argument stop suddenly, as if someone had snapped a wire. Mrs. Halvorsen stepped forward. Someone's been looking, she said plainly. They me about envelopes and stairs. They left with a name. I don't know who, but they looked like they meant to follow a trail. Her nails pinched the damp paper. That admission felt like a change in control. Where I had thought the problem was mine to solve, it became clear that someone else had already started the work of chasing traces. The revelation forced a decision. Expose the letters and risk giving a stranger the proof he wanted, or keep them hidden and risk the rumor becoming a weapon. I went home and sat at my tiny desk in the bedroom where the lamp gave a soft circle of light. I traced the torn edge with a finger until the ridges felt familiar. The emotion shifted again, suspicion to fear to a clear deliberation. I opened my locket and slipped the small torn corner inside where the gold would press paper to skin. Then I wrote a new, short note on fresh stationery. I will answer where it matters. I will not run. The sentence was not grand. It was a promise shaped to fit inside the locket and heavy with the choice it represented. I folded the note, sealed it, and tucked the folded paper into my pocket. The action was small and concrete. I chose to keep something and to hand something else over in a different form. Outside on the landing, a muffled knock sounded 3 times, quick and precise. My pen stopped. I stood and smoothed my coat, the way someone arranges themselves for a meeting. I carried the photograph to the door and held the letter in my palm like a lit ember. When I opened the door, the hallway smelled of rain and someone else's aftershave. A plain man in a coat stood there with a small notebook. He lifted his chin and said, "Marlowe, I found a scrap on the stairs. I have questions about a letter you might have written." His voice was official and careful. I folded the photograph back into the envelope and closed my hand around it. "Come in," I said. The knock at the door shifted everything from a private reckoning into a public matter. I had time to